Scope of the human resource management is usually considered as extremely wide. We always cannot restrict ourselves to have something called as a narrow approach with respect to looking at across how exactly the scope of the HRM will be there, by keeping in mind the future obligation of the organization. However, for the sake of the convenience as well as the developing of an organization, should always try to have a better understanding of how exactly things can be easily elaborated by looking at the various the scope factors that are majorly determining by looking across something called as the union or labor relations, or it might be with respect to the compensation and benefits, or it might be in case of employee assistances, or it can be with respect to organizational development, or it can be related to something called as training and development, selection and staffing, design of the organization and the job, or something called as human resource planning, or the personal research and information systems, or looking across union labor. So all these things are having a lot of connectivity between each of those scopes, as what we can observe in the chart. And when we want to start with respect to the scope of HRM, and the initial part of beginning with any of the things which are related to scope is usually we start off with something called as human resource planning. As we have seen that HRM indicates something like human resource management. Even if we take in terms of management also, planning usually plays the initial steps with respect to understanding how well we are able to plan things. And when we are talking in terms of human resource planning, it basically refers to something called as an process by which always the company would like to try its level best to find out what are the best possible job vacancies that usually exist within a particular department or in a particular domain. And apart from that, the organization would also like to look at the number of staffs that is being required, keeping across with respect to necessary aspect, looking across the qualification as well as the experience that are basically required with respect to those things. And when we look across something called as the other important scope of HRM is we are looking across something called as the job analysis, and which also considered as another important area of HRM, wherein which most of the organization are pretty much taking across something called as job analysis or as an important area that has to be given as a key priority here. Basically, when we try to understand the concept called as job analysis, which is a very pretty early thing to be discussed at this point of time, but sooner or the later we shall try to put our sincere efforts with respect to understanding how exactly we can able to define something called as job analysis. And the job analysis basically gives something called as a detailed information about something related to the job description as well as the employee specifications that are basically needed in an organization. And once we are done with this something called as a job analysis, our next key area that we need to touch upon is something called as the R&S, and which is also called as recruitment and selection. And this is the outcome which is based on something called as the information which are basically collected from job analysis, where the company always tries to prepare a very good advertisement and publish them in some of the noted newspapers or some of the what you call as hiring websites or employment websites. And they also look at looking across the various social media options that are available, something like LinkedIn or any of the other professional social media portals, which usually helps the recruiter to find these sort of suitable requirements. And we look across a number of applications that are basically gathered after giving advertisements in most of the publishing organizations. And after that, interviews are conducted and the right employee is selected for the right post at the right time. Thus, the recruitment and selection are yet another important area of HRM that has to be considered. And later on, we need to look at something called as training and development, which is also being looking across something like after any employee has been selected, most of the companies have a habit of conducting something called as an induction or an orientation program. And here the employees are informed about the companies, the background of the products or the services they are trying to offer, as well as they will try to concentrate on the different subsidiaries and the organization culture, what the company follows, and also related to the values and the work ethics that an individual has to be followed when he is being employed in such organization. And apart from that, most of the employees usually will be introduced to the other employees, which usually are one of the important part of these things. And later we need to concentrate on something called as training and development, which is also an important part of any of the organization. Here we are looking at where every employees would always like to go into something called as training program, which always helps him to put up a better performance on the job. Training program is also conducted for existing staff that have a lot of experience, which basically would be conducted with a name called as a refresher training. The training and development is one area where company always spends huge amount here. And later on, we also look at something called as a performance appraisal, where once an employee is put on the job performance, appraisal is conducted, and this appraisal are basically done based on the checks of the performance of the employees, which always helps to appraise for the future promotions, incentives, increments, across other factors related to the appraisals. And apart from that, we should also look at the organizational development, which usually focusing on the key factors like motivation, welfare, health, and safety, where motivation becomes one of the important factor to make sure that employees are going to sustain with respect to different challenges that has been posed in the organization. And it is a key job of all the HR department to look into the different methods of motivating and encouraging their employees. Apart from this, they should also look at the health and safety regulations that has to be keenly followed for the benefit of the employees. And later on, most of the employees would look at something called as the industrial relations. This is also at another important area where uh, most of the HR departments are always trying to maintain a very cordial relationship with their union members. And here it mainly tries to showcase how the employee and employer relationship are there within an organization, and also with respect to looking across how one employee will always try to respect another employee. That shows how well they are able to mutually uh, respect them with each other. And this will also help the organization to coordinate uh, uh, with one person to another person, which always helps us to have something called as smooth working conditions. And all these things are one of the key factors that most of the organization would always look at to make sure that how well they are able to achieve their individual as well as the organization objectives. Later on, we'll also be looking at the importance of HRM, where most of the organization would always look at how well HR is an important aspect of any organization. We say that HR is the one department which is considered as one of the strongest department in most of the organization, because they have both the parts with respect to both hiring and firing. So that is the reason why we give utmost priority to the HR department. And we always know that whenever we say an organization is a very strong, which always contradict with respect to looking our vision towards seeing how strong the HR department is. When we say a strong HR department, it should have a very good supporting role, which should be given by a very solid leader at the top. And it is one of the best ways for an organization which always helps to achieve something called as a total employee satisfaction. And when we talk in terms of employee satisfaction, it is not only with respect to the salary or the incentives, it is also way beyond that, which are mainly related to something called as the productivity as well as the future growth. And when we say an organization as a very good organization, that always relates to something called as a happy employees, because gone those days where we are unable to see the employees as our liabilities, because we see our employees as our key assets, and we always try to keep our assets as safe as possible. So in that context, we always make sure that our employees are very much happy, and whatever time they are spending in the organization, they should able to enjoy every bit of it, and that happiness will always showcase with respect to their productivity as well as their commitment with respect to executing the different roles and responsibilities that has been assigned from the organization side.